She did not fight when they gripped her arms and walked her down the aisle. She did not cry when Chairman Kong slid the cold ring onto her finger. She did not flinch when Madame Seo Minyoung leaned close and whispered into her ear with a smile painted on for the room, "You are nothing in this house. Remember that." Vanessa Cole simply smiled, the small private smile of a woman who has already won, and whispered back in perfect Korean, "I already have." Nobody in that chapel heard her. Nobody in that chapel understood yet that the most dangerous person within those walls had just married into them voluntarily, wearing borrowed silk and a borrowed identity, carrying an agenda that would take everything they had built and reduce it to evidence. They thought they had acquired a bride. They had opened the gate for Black Viper. 18 months before that wedding, Lagos was loud and golden and alive in the way that only Lagos can be on a Thursday morning when the city has decided it is winning. Vanessa Cole sat across from her brother Emeka at the long table in their father's compound, watching him button his suit jacket with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once genuinely feared for his life. She had always envied him that. The ease of it. The way danger slid off Emeka like rain off good leather. "You don't have to go," she said. She kept her voice level. She had learned early that Emeka responded to calm more readily than to urgency. Urgency he could dismiss as her being young, being female, being the one who worried too much. He laughed. He had their father's laugh, wide and warm, the kind that filled whatever room it entered and made people feel incorrectly that everything was fine. "Vanessa. It is a business meeting. Korean investors. Clean table, clean money. I will be back Thursday. I've read the Kong file, Emeka. There is no such thing as a clean table with that name on it." He reached across and patted her hand with the particular tenderness of someone who has already stopped listening. 4 days. I'll bring you something from Myeongdong." She watched him stand, straighten his jacket, and walk out of the compound with his security detail trailing behind him. He did not come back on Thursday. He did not come back at all. His body arrived 9 days later in a diplomatic bag, accompanied by a Korean consulate document describing a tragic road accident on a Seoul expressway. No independent witnesses. No accessible camera footage. No accountability offered and none requested, because the people who arranged the document understood very well that grief, when it arrives with enough official paperwork, has a way of making families too exhausted to ask the right questions. The Cole family was not supposed to ask questions. Vanessa stood at Emeka's burial dressed in white, the Igbo color of mourning, her face arranged into an expression so perfectly still that the rivals and associates who attended out of political obligation mistook it for numbness. It was not numbness. It was the first draft of a plan. When the compound emptied and the last condolence had been received, Chief Emmanuel Cole, the man whose name appeared in no newspaper but in every conversation that mattered across 4 countries, placed both his hands on his daughter's shoulders and looked at her with the eyes of a man who knew exactly what he had raised. "They will expect us to mourn quietly," he said. Vanessa met his gaze without blinking, without softening, without any of the grief she had already folded away into a place where it would not interfere with what needed to happen next. "That," she said, "is the first thing we will not do." She did not grieve the way the world expected her to. She grieved the way her father had spent 15 years training her to absorb every hard thing that life placed in front of her, by converting pain into precision, by making her loss into a research question, by ensuring that her mourning produced something more useful than sorrow. Within 3 weeks of Emeka's burial, Vanessa Cole had built an intelligence file on the Kong syndicate that was more comprehensive than anything held by the Nigerian Federal Intelligence Service, more current than anything the Korean authorities acknowledged possessing, and more operationally relevant than either. She worked 16 hours a day with 2 analysts she trusted completely and a network of financial investigators who did not know they were working for the same client. She studied Chairman Kang Dae-hyun the way a surgeon studies a body before making the first incision, not with feeling but with the focused, almost reverential attention of someone who understands that precision at the beginning determines survival at the end. She learned his daily architecture. His preferences in food, in music, in the specific arrangement of power within a room. She learned that he had built his empire not through violence alone but through an almost artistic talent for making other powerful men feel that they had chosen him freely, that alliances with the Kong syndicate were opportunities seized, not traps entered. She learned that he collected rare things and that what he valued most were acquisitions that other men had failed to obtain. She learned, most importantly, that for 2 years he had been searching for a strategic African partner who could open continental distribution routes his current network could not access. He needed an alliance. He would dress it as a marriage because men like Kang Dae-hyun always dressed transaction in the language of tradition. It gave them plausible distance from what they were actually doing. Vanessa began constructing her cover with the same methodical care she had given the intelligence work. Through 4 carefully separated layers of intermediaries, each one aware of only their single role, none of them aware of the others, she allowed the idea of herself to drift into Kang's acquisition network. A Cole daughter. Eligible. The family navigating vulnerability in the aftermath of a loss. Perhaps open, through the right channels, to a formal arrangement. She also began Korean language immersion the same week. 8 hours daily with a native instructor who believed she was preparing for an international business role. 30 months of standard fluency compressed into a 14-month timeline. She completed it in 11. When the message arrived through the final intermediary, Chairman Kang Dae-hyun had made a formal offer, and she was invited to Seoul. Vanessa read it once, set it face down on Emika's desk in the room she had been using as her operations center, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of complete stillness. 30 seconds for everything this meant. For Emika's laugh. For the diplomatic bag. For the fabricated accident report she had read until she had memorized every deliberate lie in it. Then she picked up her phone and began making calls. The night before she left Lagos, the Cole compound settled into a quiet that felt less like peace and more like the particular held-breath silence of a place bracing for something. Her father's senior lieutenants had completed their final briefings and gone. The Seoul contact network had been confirmed across 6 independent secure channels. 2 weapons had been prepared and concealed inside luggage that would clear screening through a routing protocol her team had tested twice. Everything that could be controlled had been controlled. Chief Emmanuel Cole sat alone at the head of the long dining table when Vanessa came downstairs, and he did not look like the man whose name made governments adjust their policies and whose silence in a negotiation was worth more than another man's signature. He looked like a father who had already lost one child to Seoul and was now watching the other one prepare to walk into the same city voluntarily. Vanessa sat across from him and did not offer comfort she didn't have. "You can still send someone else," he said. His voice was even. He was not pleading. He was presenting an option he already knew she would decline, because he had raised her and he knew exactly how she was built. "There is no one else, Papa. This role requires someone Kang will value enough to keep close and underestimate enough to ignore. Inside the same compound. Inside the same house. That is a very specific profile and it fits one person." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, Lagos moved through its nighttime sounds, generators, music from somewhere down the road, the ordinary texture of a city that did not know what was being decided at this table. "Your brother trusted the room," he finally said. "He believed the table was clean because he needed it to be. Don't trust anything you haven't verified yourself. Don't trust any room. Don't trust any version of Kang Dae-hyun that feels safe, because safety inside that compound will be the most precisely constructed lie they tell you." "I know. Promise me anyway." "I promise." She left him there and walked down the corridor to Emika's room. Nobody had touched it. His bookshelf held the same novels in the same order. His leather jacket hung on the back of the door like he had just stepped out and would be back in an hour. On his desk, in the exact center, was a framed photograph. The 2 of them at her university graduation, Emika's arm thrown wide around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something that no longer existed anywhere except in that image. She sat on the edge of his bed and held the photograph and let herself feel everything she would not be able to feel once she stepped onto that plane. Then she set it down carefully, stood up, and straightened her jacket. She walked out of the room without looking back because looking back was not something Black Viper could afford, and from this moment forward, that was who she had to be. The hanbok was jade green and ivory white, hand-embroidered along every seam with gold thread so fine it caught light differently depending on where you stood in the room. Madame Seo Min-young had selected it herself. Vanessa had been informed of this with the clear implication that she should feel honored. She understood the actual implication immediately. Dress the African woman in Korean aesthetics, Korean tradition, Korean material, and watch her identity dissolve into the costume before the ceremony even begins. The hanbok was the most strategically useful thing Seo Min-young had ever given her. Nobody watched a bride with suspicion. They watched a spectacle. Vanessa moved through the ceremony like a woman overwhelmed by the occasion, and she catalogued everything. Guard rotations. 6 men on the main floor cycling on 11-minute intervals, with a 43-second blind overlap at the northeast corridor access point that the rotation commander had not noticed because he had designed the pattern himself and humans rarely identified the flaws in their own systems. Cameras. 12 visible units, 2 probable concealed installations based on ceiling fixture shadow angles and the slight declination of a decorative panel on the west wall that had no structural reason to tilt at that specific degree. Chairman Kang's behavioral tells. His left hand moved to his cufflink when he was processing new information rather than presenting prepared material, a gesture so habitual he would never notice it himself. He never placed his back fully toward an entrance. 40 years of survival had built that instinct into his posture permanently. Madame Seo Minyoung was simpler in her architecture and more immediately dangerous because of it. She required dominance the way some people required oxygen, continuously, unconsciously, and with complete intolerance for interruption. Any perceived challenge to her positional authority within the household would make her reactive. Reactive people were predictable people. Predictable people could be managed. Park Jun-suk was the variable she could not yet fully quantify. He stood at the chapel door with the specific quality of stillness that separated trained security from hired bodies, the kind of stillness that was not passive but coiled. When Vanessa entered the chapel, he looked at her for 1.5 seconds. Not attraction. Not yet suspicion. Something more precise and more dangerous than either. The unconscious recognition of a quality in her that he shared in himself but had not yet named. She filed him in a separate mental category marked urgent. Chairman Kang Dae-hyun slid the ring onto her finger with the composed satisfaction of a man completing an acquisition he had planned carefully and executed cleanly. He believed he was the architect of this moment. Vanessa felt the ring settle against her knuckle and thought, with perfect clarity, one down. Everything else to go. Madame Seo Minyoung conducted the compound orientation with the brisk, organized authority of a woman who had spent decades ensuring that everyone within her household understood their position before they had time to imagine an alternative. She moved through the approved corridors, the meal schedules, the dress standards, and the restricted areas with the efficiency of someone who had delivered this particular briefing many times and saw no reason to make it warm. Approved contacts, 4 names, all Kang loyalists, none of them positioned to offer Vanessa any information that mattered. Restricted rooms were presented as private family spaces. Restricted communications were framed as household tradition. The family valued privacy, and the chairman's wife would naturally share that value. Vanessa took notes in a small leather notebook she had introduced on her first day specifically to play the role of an overwhelmed young woman trying to hold a foreign household's architecture in her head. She wrote carefully. She asked 2 clarifying questions that were slightly mispronounced in Korean. Errors calibrated precisely to the level of someone who had studied the language briefly but not deeply. Seo Minyoung's expression each time carried the small, satisfied compression of a woman whose assessment of the new arrival was being confirmed. On the 3rd day, Vanessa got lost. She chose the Eastern Service corridor 40 meters past the boundary of her approved route, and wandered into it with the body language of someone who had taken a wrong turn at a junction that genuinely looked similar to the approved path. Park Jun-suk found her within 4 minutes and redirected her with a flat, unreadable expression and a silence that communicated disapproval more effectively than any reprimand. She apologized in the slightly too formal Korean of someone who had learned from textbooks rather than conversation, allowed herself to look briefly mortified, and followed him back to the approved corridor without argument. The detour had taken 4 minutes and 20 seconds. It was enough. The Eastern Service corridor held a server access panel on its north wall, a backup generator housing behind a maintenance door that was alarmed but not camera monitored, and an unmarked door at the far end that exhaled cooler, slightly pressurized air, indicating either a climate-controlled storage facility or a secure room with independent ventilation. Either option was significant. Both were now mapped. That night, Vanessa lay in the dark of her assigned bedroom with her eyes open and still, building the compound's complete interior map inside her mind, room by room, system by system, overlap by overlap. Seo Minyoung had spent 3 days installing a frightened girl in a controlled environment and watching the installation take hold. She had installed Black Viper inside the walls of the Kang compound. The 2 outcomes were not remotely the same. Madame Seo Minyoung traveled to Busan on a Tuesday for a family obligation that would keep her away from the compound until Thursday evening. She left a deputy with a list of instructions for household management and an implicit expectation that the compound would hold its shape in her absence through the sheer weight of her established authority. The household did hold its shape. But without Seo Minyoung at the dinner table, the evening had a different quality entirely. Vanessa came to dinner and found one place setting across from Chairman Kang Dae-hyun and no buffer between them. No matriarch monitoring both sides of the table. No structured formality to contain whatever the conversation became. Just the 2 of them and the quiet, unscripted space of an evening that nobody had choreographed. Kang was sharper than his profile had captured. This was the first thing Vanessa registered and filed. She had built his intelligence picture from external data, board movements, territorial decisions, testimonies from people who interacted with him from positions of fear or obligation. Fear distorts portraits. People watched by those who fear them perform a version of themselves calibrated for the watcher, and what Vanessa had studied was the performance. The man across the dinner table was the original. He asked about Lagos with the specific curiosity of someone who had genuinely read about it, not the surface references that appeared in international business materials, but the textured, complicated Lagos of competing neighborhoods and layered economies and a creative energy that most foreign observers missed entirely because they were looking for the Lagos that matched their expectations. He asked about her degree in international economics and engaged her answer with the focused attention of someone who was actually thinking about what she said rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He did not speak to her like a possession. He spoke to her like a puzzle he had not finished solving, and unlike most men who treated her as a puzzle, he seemed to understand that the puzzle was considerably more complex than it appeared. Vanessa held her mask with the full discipline of 11 months of preparation. Every answer was calibrated, intelligent enough to hold his interest, contained enough to reveal nothing that mattered. But something small and structural shifted in the architecture of her plan during that dinner. Not a fracture. Not even a crack. A single degree of deviation from the expected angle, the kind of thing that looks like nothing in the moment and becomes significant only over distance. She did not include it in that evening's encrypted report to Lagos. Kang set down his chopsticks and looked at her across the table with those old, careful eyes that had been reading rooms since before she was born. "You're not afraid of me, are you?" he said. Vanessa met his gaze with the steady, level calm of a woman who had sat across from men far more immediately dangerous than the one in front of her. Should I be? The silence that followed was the most honest exchange they had shared since the wedding. Neither of them filled it. Neither of them looked away. The first anomaly Park Jun-suk catalogued and dismissed. New brides from foreign countries sometimes presented with an unusual composure. Cultural difference, personal temperament, any number of explanations that made the anomaly explicable without requiring the more complicated conclusion. The second anomaly, the precise, pre-scanning way Vanessa's eyes moved through any room she entered, always completing a full sweep before her attention settled. He attributed to general wariness. She was a young woman in an unfamiliar and clearly powerful household. Heightened environmental awareness was a reasonable adaptive response. The third anomaly he could not explain away, and he had trained too long under people who did not permit comfortable explanations to try. They were crossing the compound's east courtyard on a Thursday morning, Vanessa 2 steps ahead of him on her approved outdoor rotation, when a junior kitchen staff member dropped a full metal serving tray behind a stone pillar to their left. Sudden, percussive, genuinely startling. 3 other people in the courtyard flinched visibly. One of the exterior guards reached instinctively for his radio. Vanessa did not flinch. What she did was considerably more informative than a flinch. In the half-second between the sound and the moment a normal person's startled response would have completed, she shifted her weight to her left foot, dropped her center of gravity by approximately 3 centimeters, and began a turn toward the sound that had the specific mechanical quality of a defensive pivot rather than a surprised reaction. She caught herself within the same half-second and smoothed it into a casual glance toward the noise, then continued walking as though nothing had interrupted her morning. The recovery was excellent. Jun-suk had worked with people whose recoveries were excellent. That was itself the problem. Civilians did not need to recover from their instincts. Only trained people had instincts that required concealment. He filed no report. He amended no log. He said nothing to Seo Min-young, nothing to the chairman, nothing to anyone in the compound's security structure. Instead, he began watching Vanessa Cole with the patient, accumulating attention he reserved for threats that he could not yet prove but could not responsibly ignore. Vanessa registered the shift in his surveillance pattern by the following afternoon. She identified 3 possible responses and selected the most strategically sound. She did nothing differently. Let him watch. A man who was watching and staying silent was a man who was not yet certain, and uncertainty maintained carefully was a resource. The moment he became certain, the calculation would change. Until then, she gave him nothing new to work with and waited to see what he would do with what he already had. That night, well past the end of his shift rotation, Park Jun-suk stood in the corridor outside her wing. He did not knock. He did not announce himself. He stood in the corridor in the dark and thought about the 3 anomalies and what they added up to, and whether what they added up to was something he could continue to hold alone. The notification arrived through her secondary channel at 13 minutes past 2 on a Wednesday morning. A sequence of numbers embedded in what appeared to be a routine shipping manifest update, decrypted by a key she had memorized and never written down anywhere. The message it produced was 11 words long and cold enough to pull her upright in the dark. Crane was lifted. Rival faction. Holding location unknown. Timeline compromised. She sat with it for a moment. Crane was an operative she knew only by alias and dead drop protocol, one of 6 soul-based contacts positioned across the city to support the mission's outer infrastructure. He did not know her name. He did not know her location inside the compound. But he knew the mission's operational shape well enough that a skilled interrogator with the right questions and enough time could work backward from his knowledge to a geography, and from a geography to a compound, and from a compound to a bride who was not what she appeared. She had, by her most generous estimate, 48 hours. She could not contact Lagos. Any communication spike from inside the compound would register against the baseline Junsook's newly sharpened attention had almost certainly established. She could not leave the compound without triggering a response that would accelerate the very timeline she needed to interrupt. She could not request any form of external assistance without exposing a network that existed, from the compound's perspective, in a world that had nothing to do with Chairman Kang's new wife. She sat in the dark for 11 minutes. She counted them. 11 minutes was what she permitted herself. Then she opened the mental file she had built on the compound's internal intelligence archive, accessed 6 weeks ago during the deliberate wrong corridor walk, photographed with a device built into the notebook she carried visibly everywhere, and she found what she needed inside it. The rival faction that held Crane had been an irritant on the eastern edge of Kang's territorial boundary for 14 months. She had documented them during her research phase as a secondary operational note. They ran 3 holding locations. Their communication frequencies were logged. Their leadership structure had a specific vulnerability at the mid-tier that made them susceptible to targeted intelligence pressure from above. She constructed the information package in 4 hours, working by the light of a device no larger than a thumb, in a bathroom with the shower running. She routed it through a channel she had built specifically for compound-adjacent intelligence contributions, framed, as always, as material beneficial to the Kang Syndicate's ongoing territorial management. Anonymous, untraceable to the compound's interior. Kang's external intelligence unit acted on it by Thursday morning. The faction's eastern holding site was raided. Crane was extracted in the operational disruption, not rescued deliberately, simply moved in the chaos of a location being cleared, and the intelligence thread that led toward the compound was severed before it had completed its journey. By Friday, the compound had returned to its established rhythms. Nobody inside its walls understood what had happened or why the rival faction problem had resolved itself so cleanly that week. Vanessa stood at her bedroom window in the gray early soul dawn, watching the courtyard below reabsorb its ordinary patterns, and became aware of a thin line of dried blood along the heel of her left palm where she had pressed too hard against the desk's metal edge during those 11 minutes of stillness. She pressed a cloth against it, applied steady pressure, held it until the bleeding stopped completely, keeping her eyes on the courtyard the entire time, watching the compound she had spent 9 weeks learning move through a morning it did not know she had just saved. The intelligence arrived on a Saturday, embedded inside a routine shipping manifest her Lagos contact had routed through a freight company that sent weekly documentation to the compound's logistics office. Vanessa received her copy through the household standard administrative channel, one of the small, patient infrastructure pieces she had arranged during her first weeks inside, and she read it at the desk in her room with the unhurried attention of someone reviewing household supply orders. She read it 3 times. Then she set it down and sat with it for 2 hours, with Emika's photograph open on her phone screen and the compound quiet around her and everything she had built over the past 18 months laid out in her mind like a map she was now seeing from a different altitude. The order that killed Emika Cole had not come from Chairman Kang Dae-hyun. Kang had been the setting. The meeting, the table, the location, the cover. But the specific operational instruction, the deliberate, precisely timed instruction to eliminate Emika before the Cole-Kang partnership negotiation could reach its final stage, had originated from a man named Director Oh Sang-woo, a senior figure embedded within Kang's own financial intelligence structure. A man who had spent 3 years engineering his own succession to the syndicate's leadership by methodically removing every external alliance that would have consolidated Kang's power and reduced his own room to maneuver. Emika's partnership would have been the largest and most stable African alliance in the syndicate's history. It would have made Kang unassailable from within his own organization for the next decade. Oh Sang-woo had understood this with perfect clarity and had removed the alliance at its most critical and vulnerable point, then dressed the removal in the forensic clothing of a Kang decision and buried it under diplomatic paperwork, knowing that the Cole family's grief would prevent them from looking past the surface of what they had been handed. He had been almost right. Vanessa sat with the truth of it for the full 2 hours. She sat with the version of the plan she had arrived with and measured it against the version of the truth she now held, and she made herself do this completely and without shortcuts, because shortcuts in this kind of recalculation were where people made the mistakes that got them and everyone they loved killed. Then she picked up Emika's photograph, looked at it one final time, and placed it carefully in her inside pocket. Against her chest where she could feel its weight. She walked down the corridor to Kang's private office. The guard stepped back. She was the chairman's wife, and Kang had quietly established in the compound's first weeks that she was to move without impediment. She had saved that access for this moment without ever fully articulating to herself that this was what she was saving it for. She opened the door. Kang looked up from a desk covered in the organized cross-reference material of a man who still ran his own intelligence work rather than delegating it entirely, and his expression shifted through surprise and then into the specific alertness of a man who had survived long enough to know that unexpected things arriving in private spaces were almost always significant. Vanessa sat down across from him without being invited. She placed the photograph on the desk between them, not Emika's but Oh Sang-woo's, printed from the intelligence report and marked in red, and she slid it across the desk surface with the steady, unhurried hand of a woman who had been building to this moment for 18 months and was no longer in any hurry at all. "We need to talk," she said. "Not as husband and wife. As two people who want the same man dead." Kang looked at the photograph. Something moved through his face that she had not seen in any of the expressions she had catalogued over 9 weeks. Not arrogance, not calculation, not the composed authority of a man performing power. Something older and more unguarded than any of those. The face of a man seeing confirmation of a betrayal he had suspected for years but could not prove. Then he looked at her. Not at the bride. Not at the acquisition. Not at the young African woman he believed he had brought into his compound on his own terms and by his own design. He looked at whoever was actually sitting across from him, and for the first time since the chapel, what passed between them was something completely unscripted by either of their plans. "Who are you?" he asked. Vanessa reached up and removed her glasses. "My name is Vanessa Cole," she said quietly and without performance. "You may know me by another name." The silence in the office was unlike any silence that had preceded it in that compound. It was not the silence of power arranged above powerlessness. It was not the silence of predator and acquisition, of captor and captive, of a man who believed he had purchased something and a woman pretending he was right. It was the silence of two people who had each believed they were the most dangerous person in the room, arriving simultaneously at the understanding that they had both been correct, and that the person who had used them both was still outside these walls, still moving, still entirely unaware that the two people he had manipulated into opposing corners had just found each other across a desk in Seoul on a Saturday morning. The real operation was only now beginning. The most dangerous person in any room is never the one who announces their power loudest. Vanessa Cole walked into enemy territory in silence, inside a borrowed costume, performing a role designed to render her invisible, because she understood a truth that her enemies had never been required to learn. Genuine power does not need an audience. It arrives quietly. It studies everything. It moves only when the moment has been prepared so thoroughly that the outcome is no longer in question. But this story carries a harder lesson beneath that one. Vanessa came to Seoul carrying a plan built on certainty. Certainty about who the enemy was, certainty about what justice required, certainty that she had accounted for every variable. And the truth, when it arrived, did not care about her certainty. It required her to dismantle 18 months of architecture and rebuild from the ground up, in real time inside enemy walls, with no external support and no margin for error. The real test of strength is not whether your plan survives the journey. It is whether you survive the moment you discover your plan was built on an incomplete map, and whether you have the discipline, the courage, and the clarity to draw a better one. Vanessa did not come to Seoul to make allies. She came for justice. But justice, when it is real and when it lasts, is rarely built alone. Sometimes the door you came to destroy is the same door you must walk through together. That is the difference between revenge and reckoning. And it is the difference between a woman who reacts to power and a woman who becomes it.